In the 1920s, archaeologists cracking open sealed jars inside an Egyptian tomb found something that should not have existed: honey, thousands of years old, still smooth, still gold, still edible. No mold, no rot, no trace of decay. Just honey, patiently waiting in the dark for someone to finally take a taste. Think about that for a second. Leave a piece of bread out for a week, and it turns into a science experiment. Leave meat out for a day, and your kitchen becomes unlivable. But honey, sealed away in the tombs of pharaohs for 3,000 years, simply refused to die. That single, strange fact should stop you in your tracks. Because it means honey is not really food in the way we think about food at all. It behaves more like a mineral than an organic substance, defying the most basic rule of biology, that anything alive, or anything made by something alive, eventually breaks down. So how does a sticky golden liquid made by insects manage to cheat time itself? And what happens to human civilization once people realize they've stumbled onto something that never spoils, never rots, and never truly dies? That question, it turns out, is not just a curiosity for chemists. It is the hinge on which an enormous, tangled history swings, one that runs through ancient tombs and Greek temples, through medieval monasteries and Caribbean sugar plantations, through world wars, and eventually into a shocking modern scandal happening right now on your own supermarket shelf. Because once you understand why honey never spoils, you start to understand why humans have spent thousands of years fighting over it, worshipping it, taxing it, faking it, and building entire empires on the back of it. This is the story of how a jar of something almost supernatural became one of the most desired, fought over, and quietly deceptive substances in human history. It begins not in a laboratory, but in the dripping, torch-lit mouth of a cave, with a human being risking their life for a taste of something sweet. Picture a limestone cliff somewhere in eastern Spain, long before anyone had a word for Spain, or for time, or for danger. A figure clings to a rope woven from plant fiber, smoke curling upward from a torch held in one hand, while below them stretches a drop that would kill instantly if the grip failed. Around them, in a furious cloud, fly the insects whose home they are about to rob. This is not a myth. It is a scene painted directly onto rock, preserved for archaeologists to find millennia later in a site known as the Cuevas de la Ara, and it stands today as the oldest visual record we have of humans deliberately harvesting honey from wild bees. The painting shows exactly what the act required: courage, smoke to subdue the hive, and a willingness to dangle over open air for the sake of something sweet. Long before agriculture, before writing, before the wheel, human beings were already treating honey as worth risking their necks for. Think about that for a second. We had not yet figured out how to grow our own food reliably, and yet we had already figured out how to steal dessert from an angry swarm of insects hanging off a cliff face. That tells you something about how powerful the craving for sweetness is, and how early it took root in the human brain. Honey hunting like this was not a one-off. Similar rock art depicting the same practice, humans using smoke and rope to raid wild hives, has turned up across different regions, suggesting this was a widespread survival strategy, not an isolated stunt. And once agriculture and settled civilization did arrive, honey did not fade into the background as a mere snack. It became something closer to sacred. In ancient Egypt, honey was buried with the dead, offered to gods, and used in embalming, because a substance that resisted decay seemed like the obvious ingredient for a culture obsessed with defying death. Egyptian temple offerings included honey specifically because it did not rot, which to the Egyptian mind made it a fitting gift for eternity. In ancient Greece, honey was tied directly to divinity. Mythology held that the infant god Zeus was fed honey, and priestesses at certain oracles were referred to as melissae, the Greek word for bees, linking the insect and its product to prophecy, purity, and the sacred feminine. Bees themselves were treated as messengers between the human world and the divine one. Their industriousness and hive-mind cooperation seen as a small, buzzing model of cosmic order. Across multiple early goddess-worshipping traditions, bees and honey became symbolically fused with fertility, motherhood, and rebirth. The hive itself functioning as a kind of miniature underworld and afterlife rolled into one, endlessly dying and regenerating with the seasons. None of this reverence was random. It was built on a very real, very observable fact. Honey simply did not behave like other food. It did not mold in the jar. It did not sour with age. In a world without refrigeration, without preservatives, without any scientific vocabulary for bacteria or decay, that kind of permanence looked like nothing short of magic. So people did what humans have always done when they encounter something that defies explanation. They built rituals around it, assigned it to gods, and treated its harvesting as a sacred act rather than a mundane chore. But magic, as it turns out, is usually just chemistry that nobody has explained yet. So let's ask the obvious question the ancients never could. Why does honey never spoil? For thousands of years, the answer was simply the gods will it so. Priests attributed it to divine favor, and ordinary people were happy to let the mystery stand, because an unspoiled jar of honey looked like proof of something eternal. Even today, the legend persists in a softened, secular form. You will hear people repeat, almost like scripture, that honey is immortal or magic, a food untouched by the normal rules of nature. It sounds romantic. It is also, unfortunately for the romantics, completely explainable. Honey's immortality is not supernatural. It is a defense system engineered by bees over millions of years of evolution, and it comes down to three unglamorous, entirely earthly properties: moisture, acidity, and a slow chemical drip of hydrogen peroxide. Start with moisture. Bacteria and fungi, the organisms responsible for almost all food spoilage, need water to survive and multiply. Honey has almost none of it. Bees process nectar by repeatedly ingesting and regurgitating it, and by fanning it with their wings inside the hive, evaporating out most of the water content until what remains is a thick, viscous syrup with a moisture level typically under 18%. That is an inhospitable desert for any microorganism looking to set up shop. In fact, honey is what chemists call hygroscopic, meaning it actively pulls moisture out of anything it touches, including bacteria and mold spores. Rather than providing a wet environment for microbes to thrive in, honey essentially dehydrates them to death on contact. Then there is the acidity. Honey typically sits at a pH between 3 and 4.5, roughly comparable to items you would find in the vinegar and citrus aisle, a chemical environment hostile to the vast majority of bacteria, which prefer a near-neutral pH to reproduce. And finally, there is the enzyme bees add during that regurgitation process, called glucose oxidase, which reacts with the natural sugars in honey to slowly produce small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, the same compound sitting in a brown bottle in your medicine cabinet labeled antiseptic. It is a slow, steady antimicrobial drip built directly into the food itself. Low moisture, high acidity, and a built-in disinfectant. Combine those three factors, and you get an environment where bacteria, yeast, and mold simply cannot function. which is precisely why archaeologists opening those 3,000-year-old Egyptian tombs found honey that had not fermented, molded, or rotted in any conventional sense. It was not magic preserving those jars. It was extremely competent insect engineering. And that is arguably a more interesting story than divine intervention anyway, because it means the ancients were not worshipping a miracle so much as accidentally worshipping a chemistry lab that also happened to make excellent toast topping. Understanding this science does not diminish the myth, though. If anything, it reframes it. Ancient people were not foolish for treating honey as sacred. They were responding, with the tools available to them, to a real and measurable anomaly in the natural world. They just filled the explanatory gap with gods and ritual instead of enzymes and pH scales. That impulse, dressing hard chemistry in the language of the divine, is a pattern we will see again and again as honey moves out of caves and temples and into the hands of kings, monks, and eventually corporations, each of whom would find their own reasons to mythologize, control, and eventually exploit that same jar of golden, deathless syrup. Once you understand that honey does not spoil, you understand why every ambitious ruler in the ancient world wanted a monopoly on it. A substance that lasts essentially forever, that tastes like nothing else available, and that requires genuine skill to harvest safely, is not just food. It is wealth that does not decay, which in the ancient world made it one of the closest things to a stable currency that existed. In Egypt, honey was not simply offered to gods and packed into tombs for the afterlife. It was taxed, recorded, and redistributed by a state bureaucracy that treated apiculture as a matter of national interest. Temple and palace records list honey alongside grain and cattle as tribute, and beekeepers were organized well enough that hives were transported along the Nile on rafts, moved from region to region to follow the flowering seasons. A logistical operation that implies planning, oversight, and almost certainly some official standing somewhere in the chain counting jars. Rulers were not doing this out of sentiment. They were doing it because honey was medicine, preservative, sweetener, and religious offering all at once. And whoever controlled its supply controlled something people genuinely could not do without. Move west and forward in time to Rome, and the pattern repeats with even more bureaucratic enthusiasm. Roman elites treated honey as a marker of refinement, stirring it into wine to make mulsum, coating meats in it, using it to mask the taste of foods that had not aged particularly well, which, again, given honey's antimicrobial properties, was not merely superstition. Roman writers on agriculture, men writing practical manuals for landowners, devoted entire sections to the correct management of bees, describing hive placement, seasonal harvesting, and the economics of apiaries with the same seriousness applied to vineyards and olive groves. Beekeeping under Rome was not a rustic hobby. It was a documented, regulated agricultural sector, complete with property disputes over swarms and rules about how close one landowner's hives could sit to another's crops, because bees, being bees, did not respect boundaries drawn on a map. This is really the moment honey stops being purely sacred and starts being openly economic, though the two categories never fully separated. A pharaoh accepting honey as tribute was making a religious statement and a fiscal one simultaneously. A Roman senator serving mulsum at a banquet was demonstrating piety toward tradition and flexing personal wealth in the same gesture. Honey had become a kind of dual-purpose social technology, sacred enough to bury with the dead, valuable enough to fight over, tax, transport, and regulate. And once any substance reaches that status, once it is simultaneously a religious object and a taxable good, History tells us exactly what happens next. Someone builds an institution around it. In Egypt, that institution was the temple palace bureaucracy. In Rome, it was written agricultural law. And in the centuries that followed, as the old empires fractured and Europe reorganized itself around new centers of authority, that institution would take an even more unexpected form. Not a palace, not a senate, but a monastery, where monks of all people would turn beekeeping into a precise, almost liturgical craft, and turn honey into something closer to alchemy than agriculture. Rome fell, but the bees kept working, indifferent to the collapse of empires, and the people who inherited their labor were an unlikely group. Cloistered monks, with vows of silence and ledgers full of numbers. Medieval monasteries became, almost by accident, the most sophisticated beekeeping operations in Europe. And the reason was structural rather than spiritual. Monasteries had land, labor, literacy, and a reason to keep meticulous records, which meant beekeeping techniques that might have stayed folk knowledge elsewhere instead got written down, refined, and passed between religious houses like a trade secret. The tool of choice was the skep, a dome-shaped basket woven from coiled straw, cheap to make, and easy to place along a monastery wall in long, humming rows. There is a brutal detail worth pausing on here. Harvesting honey from a skep usually meant destroying the colony, either by smoking the bees into submission or, in harsher practice, killing them outright to get at the comb inside, since the woven basket had no removable parts and no easy way to extract honey without tearing the whole structure apart. Beekeeping, in other words, was still closer to a one-time raid than a sustainable partnership, a problem nobody would seriously solve for another 600 years. But what monks lacked in humane technique, they made up for in obsessive documentation. They tracked swarming seasons, recorded which hives produced the most comb, and treated the apiary with the same procedural seriousness as the scriptorium. And once you have surplus honey sitting in a monastery storeroom, you inevitably get fermentation, because honey mixed with water and left alone does not just sit there, it becomes mead, one of the oldest alcoholic beverages in human history, and monasteries turned its production into something approaching a science. Mead was strong, sweet, shelf-stable, and crucially, did not require the vineyards that grape wine did, which made it perfectly suited to the cooler climates of northern and central Europe, where monasteries were multiplying. Beyond the fermentation vats, honey served an even more practical role. It was medicine. Physicians and monastic healers used honey to dress wounds, soothe coughs, and preserve other ingredients in remedies, leaning on the same antibacterial properties, though nobody called them that yet, that had kept Egyptian tomb honey edible for millennia. It was also the era's preservative of choice, used to keep fruit, meat, and medicinal herbs from spoiling long before refrigeration existed, meaning honey was simultaneously a beverage, a drug, and a food safety technology. And all of this made it a serious trade commodity. Monasteries sold surplus honey and beeswax to nearby towns, and beeswax alone was enormously valuable, since it was the primary material for candles used in churches, homes, and increasingly bureaucracies that needed light to keep working after dark. For centuries, this was simply how sweetness worked in Europe. Monks kept the bees made the comb became mead or medicine or candlelight, and honey sat unchallenged as the primary sweetener available to anyone, peasant or bishop, who could get their hands on it. There was, as far as most Europeans were concerned, no alternative. That would not last. Just as honey had transitioned from sacred object to taxable good under Egypt and Rome, it was now about to face something it had never encountered before. Not a rival ritual, not a competing empire, but a competing product, arriving by ship, backed by capital, and utterly indifferent to tradition. That competing product was sugar, and it did not politely enter the market so much as invade it. Sugar cane itself was nothing new. It had been cultivated in parts of Asia for centuries and trickled into the Mediterranean through Arab trade routes, where it was treated as an exotic luxury, a spice more than a staple, sold in small quantities at prices only the wealthiest households could justify. Honey, by contrast, was local, cheap to obtain if you had a hive, and already woven into the medicine cabinet and the pantry. Sugar had no such foothold. What sugar had instead was Europe's colonial appetite for expansion, and once that appetite turned toward the Caribbean and the coasts of the Americas, everything changed. Plantation by plantation, colonial powers discovered that the climate of islands like Barbados, Hispaniola, and Jamaica was almost perfectly suited to sugarcane, a crop that is brutally labor-intensive to harvest and process, requiring workers to cut, crush, and boil cane under grueling heat on tight schedules before the juice spoiled. That labor need was filled through the transatlantic slave trade, an atrocity that forcibly transported millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas, a substantial portion of them destined specifically for sugar plantations. This is the part of honey's story that has almost nothing to do with bees and everything to do with human brutality. The sweetness that eventually displaced honey on European tables was built on a foundation of forced labor, mass death, and colonial violence on a scale the honey trade, whatever its own histories of taxation and hoarding, had never approached. Sugar did not simply compete with honey. It weaponized economies of scale honey could never match. A monastery could produce only as much honey as its hives allowed, limited by bee biology and the seasons. A sugar plantation, powered by forced human labor and expanding colonial land grabs, could scale production almost without limit. And it did. Sugar production in the Caribbean surged over the following centuries, and the sugar that flowed back to Europe arrived cheaper, more consistent, and more versatile in cooking than honey had ever been. Refined sugar dissolved cleanly, carried no distinct flavor of its own to clash with other ingredients, and could be shipped in stable, dry form without the risk of fermenting in transit the way honey sometimes did. For merchants and cooks alike, it was simply easier to work with. Think about that for a second. An industry built on humans suffering out competed an industry built on insects, and it won largely on convenience. By the 17th and 18th centuries, sugar had shifted from luxury spice to household staple across much of Europe, showing up in tea, in baking, in preserving fruit, in nearly every role honey had once occupied alone. Honey did not disappear. It retreated, becoming the rustic, old-fashioned option, the thing grandmothers used, while sugar became the modern choice, the taste of empire and progress, dressed up as a simple household convenience. The market, if we can personify it for a moment, did not care about tradition, ritual, or the centuries of monastic craft that had sustained honey's dominance. It cared about price, volume, and profit. And on those terms, sugar was simply built to win. All right, quick pause in the story here. If you have been sitting with us through cave paintings, pharaohs, monks, and now the slow dethroning of honey by an empire built on cane and cruelty, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Think about it this way. A beehive runs on tens of thousands of individual workers, each one doing a small, unglamorous task. None of them particularly impressive alone, but together they produce something that outlasts civilizations. A single click from you is basically one wing beat in that hive. It does not feel like much on its own, but multiply it across everyone watching, and suddenly you have got a colony powerful enough to keep this channel alive and buzzing. So consider this your foraging duty for the day. Subscribe, ring the bell if you want notifications, and then get back to work, because there is a lot more history left in this jar. And speaking of work left to do, the story does not end with sugar's takeover. In fact, this is where things get almost mechanical. Because once sugar had claimed the throne, honey did not vanish from the world stage. It simply changed jobs. Where it had once been sacred tribute, medicine, currency, and preservative, it now had to compete on an industrial playing field. And that meant beekeeping itself had to industrialize or risk becoming a quaint museum practice. For roughly 6,000 years, humans had managed bees more or less the same way. Skeps, smoke, and destruction, killing or displacing colonies just to get at the comb inside. That method had survived Egyptian dynasties, Roman tax collectors, and medieval monasteries largely unchanged. But the 19th century, the same century that watched sugar plantations scale into vast industrial operations, was about to do something similar to the beehive. The tools of the industrial age, precision manufacturing, standardized parts, and a growing scientific curiosity about nature's mechanisms were about to be pointed directly at the inside of a beehive, and the person holding that lens was about to change beekeeping more radically than anyone had since the first honey hunters climbed down from those Spanish cliffs 8,000 years earlier. What happened next did not just save honey from irrelevance. It set the stage for an industry so large, so global, and so profitable that it would eventually attract the kind of fraud that makes ancient tomb robbers look almost quaint by comparison. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the hive itself had to be rebuilt from the inside out. Enter a man with a wooden box and a very specific grievance against destruction. He was a clergyman with a scientific streak, the kind of 19th century mind that could not look at a natural process without wanting to take it apart and rebuild it more efficiently. His breakthrough was deceptively simple: a hive built around removable wooden frames, spaced with just enough room between them that bees would fill with comb, but never permanently seal shut with the sticky wax bridges called propolis. For the first time in 6,000 years of human beekeeping, a person could open a hive, lift out a frame heavy with honey, inspect it, harvest it, and slide it right back in, without killing a single bee or destroying a single colony. It sounds almost too small an invention to matter. It mattered enormously. The movable frame hive turned beekeeping from a one-time destructive raid into a repeatable, manageable, endlessly renewable harvest. Colonies could be inspected for disease, requeened, split into new colonies, or trucked across state lines to follow blooming crops. Beekeeping stopped being a rural curiosity and became an industry with inventories, equipment catalogs, and, before long, national and international supply chains. Bees went to work for California almond growers, for apple orchards, for entire agricultural economies that needed pollination on an industrial scale. Honey becoming almost a byproduct of a much bigger business in crop fertilization. By the 20th century, honey had transformed from a monastery's side project into a globally traded commodity, shipped in bulk drums, blended, filtered, pasteurized, and shelved in supermarkets under reassuring pastoral labels featuring cartoon bees and rolling meadows. And that is precisely where the trouble started. Because whenever you turn a scarce, difficult-to-produce natural product into a mass commodity with a label people trust without reading closely, you create an irresistible opportunity for somebody, somewhere, to cut corners. Real honey is expensive to produce. It takes real bees, real flowers, real time, and a real climate willing to cooperate. Fake honey, or honey diluted with cheap sugar syrups made from rice, corn, or beet sugar, costs a fraction of that and can be manufactured in a factory with no bees involved at all. Journalists and food safety investigators digging into supermarket shelves across multiple countries over the past 2 decades found something the honey industry did not want printed. A significant share of the jars labeled pure honey were not pure at all. Some had been cut with syrup, some had been so heavily processed, filtered to strip out the pollen that normally allows regulators to trace its geographic origin, that investigators could no longer even determine what country or what flower it had actually come from. The practice earned its own nickname among investigators who traced shipments rerouted through third countries specifically to dodge tariffs and disguise origin. Honey laundering. It is, when you think about it, a strange kind of fraud. Ancient Egyptians embalmed their dead with honey, believing in its incorruptibility. Modern corporations, 4,000 years later, were quietly corrupting the very product that history had once trusted as the one food that never lies. So let us go back to where we started. A sealed jar pulled from the tomb of an Egyptian pharaoh, its contents still soft, still golden, still, by any reasonable definition, edible after 3,000 years in the dark. That is the fact that opened this story, and it is worth sitting with one more time now that you know everything that happened between that tomb and your kitchen cupboard. The honey survived because of chemistry, low moisture, high acidity, a trickle of hydrogen peroxide that bees themselves manufacture, an environment so hostile to bacteria and fungus that decay simply gives up and goes elsewhere. No magic, no blessing. Just an extraordinary molecular accident that a colony of insects perfected millions of years before humans existed to marvel at it. But the fact that honey does not spoil is only half the story, and arguably the less interesting half. The more interesting half is what human beings did once they realized they were holding something that seemed to cheat death. They painted it onto cave walls in Spain 8,000 years ago. They offered it to gods in Egypt and Greece as if it were liquid divinity. They taxed it, hoarded it, fermented it into mead in monastery cellars, embalmed their pharaohs with it, and eventually let an empire built on enslaved labor in the Caribbean shove it off its own throne as the world's sweetener of choice. Honey did not just feed people. It got dragged into ritual, economics, colonization, and eventually, boardrooms. Think about that for a second. A food so stable it can outlast civilizations has spent most of recorded history being manipulated by the civilizations trying to control it. And that manipulation did not stop when sugar took over. It just changed shape. The same purity that once made honey sacred enough to seal inside a pharaoh's tomb is now the exact quality that modern fraudsters exploit, stretching it with cheap syrup, filtering out the pollen that would expose its origin, laundering shipments through third countries, selling adulterated jars under a label that still, quietly, invokes bees and wildflowers and old-fashioned honesty. The ancient Egyptians trusted honey because it did not lie. The modern honey industry, in far too many documented cases, discovered that people still believe that. and built a business model on the gap between the belief and the truth. So the next time you twist open a plastic bear-shaped bottle in a supermarket aisle, know what you are actually holding. You are holding 6,000 years of honey hunters, priests, pharaohs, monks, colonizers, industrialists, and fraud investigators, compressed into a single sticky, golden, deeply misunderstood substance. Honey is the only food humans have ever trusted, precisely because it refuses to rot, and the only food some of us have been quietly deceived by, precisely because we trusted it too much. That is the paradox sitting on your shelf right now. The most incorruptible food in human history, sold to you inside one of its most corruptible industries. Honey never lied to you. It was other people, holding the jar, who did.